Here's part 2 of background briefing on inter-familial sexual abuse.
Reconcile. After pleading guilty to abusing his daughter, John didn't go to jail. He entered a program which was the only one of its kind in Australia.
At the time, I would much rather have been sitting in jail. Jail would have been the much simpler option for me at the time, being, I was still fairly self-focused, and in prison I'd only have to worry about myself.
John was sent to Cedar Cottage, a pre-trial diversion program for first-time child sex offenders, which aims to force the offender to repeatedly confront the impact of what they've done. John was still charged and convicted, but instead of being sent to prison, he was allowed to live in the community in return for pleading guilty. His whereabouts were closely monitored, he had to report regularly to police, and he had to attend 2 years of intensive therapy.
It was actually very difficult to go down into the emotional aspects of what I was feeling at the time, as well as, putting myself into my daughter's position and determining, what she may have been feeling at the time.
Cedar Cottage also offered therapy to his devastated ex-wife, Frances, and to the victim, John's daughter Clementine, who's now 17.
I remember it started to happen around when I was 1 year old, and it went for about, I think, 7 to 8 years or something. But then when I started to turn around 10, 11, I started to find that it wasn't right. It just didn't feel right, just a natural instinct. When I was around 11 or 12, I started to ask Dad, why are you doing this? And he'd just say, it's okay, just forget it. So,
And how did you feel when that happened?
I didn't want to make it a big thing. I was a bit scared at the time, so I just left it.
Clementine eventually told a school friend who made her tell the school counsellor. Her father was charged, convicted, and the whole family began the Cedar Cottage therapy program. Clementine was just 13 at the time.
It was really, really hard because naturally I'm a shy person, so I don't really like to talk to people about my personal life or anything like that. So it took years to get answers out of me or for me to say something on my behalf. I felt really guilty that I kind of broke up my family. And it just took me a long time just to realize that it was my dad's responsibility and not mine.
Their family unit had been a small one. Clementine was an only child, and she was groomed by her father from an early age. What's not often discussed is that grooming doesn't just apply to the victim. John's ex-wife Frances had also been groomed for years.
Cup of coffee is a really good example where, you call me up, oh, what time are you coming home? Just want to make sure dinner's ready and, you've got a nice cup of coffee ready for you, and I had no idea that was grooming.
John was controlling and almost from the start systematically worked to break down the bonds between mother and daughter.
I actually created a hostile environment at home, so she would spend most of her evenings at work and she wouldn't get home until late. So this again reinforced, the idea of me being the primary parent.
When Clementine disclosed to a counsellor that her father had been abusing her, Frances's world crumbled and the guilt began. In the very early years, Frances says there were a few small signs of things going wrong, but they were easily dismissed.
She had this strange thing about, every time I take her to the toilet, she'd always have to undress herself fully instead of just, taking her bottom part off to go to the toilet. But it wasn't anything that I could, looking back, pinpoint and say, oh, she's been groomed.
The family's entire financial assets were all in John's name, and the debt was in Frances's. If John went to prison, she and Clementine would have lost their home. But living in the community, John was still able to work.
I thought, well, if he thinks he could just go to jail and not be responsible while we're suffering out here and he gets his meals cooked, he's got another thing coming. So that's when I thought, okay, I'll take this option.
Offenders who enter Cedar Cottage have to plead guilty, A guilty plea is notoriously difficult to obtain in cases of child sexual abuse. Partway through Cedar Cottage therapy, offenders often admit to further sex offences, which then result in extra charges. John was no different.
I didn't actually deny what I'd done, but at the same time I didn't fully disclose what I'd done.
During his first trial, John claimed he'd stopped sexually abusing Clementine when she was in Year 5 and first questioned him about his behaviour. This was a lie. John had continued to abuse his daughter at night when she was apparently asleep.
It was similar types of sexual abuse, but, during the times when I knew she wouldn't know.
Did she ever wake up?
I don't believe she did. If she had not said anything.
After a while, John's progress in therapy began to stall. He realised he had to lay it all out and put it all in a letter which was handed to police. As a result, John was charged and convicted of another 5 serious counts of child sexual abuse. He was bailed on the condition that he stay in the Cedar Cottage program. Would you have admitted to those extra offences which had not come before a court if you were not in the Cedar Cottage program?
I don't think I would have. If I'd gone to jail, I would have served my time and then got out and lived my life with the extra information still being a secret.
Bringing forward the extra charges brought more immediate pain to Clementine and Francis.
I was pissed off that it didn't come out earlier. And then obviously we went through the whole thing was, well, how am I confident that everything else that you've said is true? When the extra charges came on, I kind of cracked a little and I fell into depression and anxiety around that time. That's when I started to self-harm and it just kind of got worse over time.
Ultimately, Francis says what saved Clementine's life were the answers provided by John through therapy. Cedar Cottage forced him to write face-ups. These are letters in which he admitted to his behaviour and answered any questions they had. It was Clementine's only contact with her father.
To Clementine, I'm writing this in the hope of answering your question that this was in the past I said and did things that made you feel talentless. You asked me why did I do this. What I was doing was trying to put you down in order to undermine your feeling of self-worth, so I could feel better about myself.
Were the answers always helpful?
They were helpful in a sense that it kind of take off that guilt, but it still didn't help me understand why he did it.
Allowing the perpetrators to remain in the community while being treated is always going to attract political flack. It helped that Cedar Cottage delivered results. A 15-year study of the program by Charles Sturt University found that low-risk sex offenders who completed Cedar Cottage were 80% less likely to sexually re-offend than those who declined to take part. Dale Tolliday is the clinical director of the Cedar Cottage program. He says community-based programs keep sex offenders in a real-life environment during treatment instead of an artificial one like prison.
You can, for the same dollar spend, provide treatment to a lot more people. In community-based treatment, you can integrate the treatment with those individuals, with their families, with their social networks, and in the ways in which they are living their life from day to day.
Like all states and territories, New South Wales has in-prison treatment programs for adult sex offenders, which research has shown help prevent re-offending. But Cedar Cottage is for first-time, non-violent inter-familial sex offenders. Dale Tolliday says the prison programs have different priorities.
Because there's a lot of pressure on the services provided to adults in prison, the adults who are identified as the highest risk are the more likely to get the highest degree of resource. So an adult, for example, who has sexually harmed their own child, or as a father or a stepfather, is likely to get no treatment or very little treatment.
Despite its apparent success, last year New South Wales Attorney General Greg Smith axed the program, saying the community expected sex offenders to go to jail.
Well, I don't believe that the community accepts the Cedar Cottage program as reflecting the community's attitude, and that's why we shut it down.
While the last offenders wind up their treatment at Cedar Cottage, the therapy of one of its clients may be cut short in favour of sending him to jail. Greg Smith has overridden his own Director of Public Prosecutions to lodge an appeal in one particularly high-profile case.
I believe the sentence, which is a good behaviour bond, was manifestly inadequate, and I just think that, a bond is ridiculous.
The offender repeatedly sexually assaulted his daughter for 5 years, starting when she was 12. He was charged and began the Cedar Cottage program in November last year. But his daughter, who's now in intensive psychiatric treatment, is angry he wasn't jailed. Recently, there's been a number of articles in News Limited papers about the fact that her abuser walked free. The Attorney-General is now appealing the decision to send him to Cedar Cottage instead of prison.
That Cedar Cottage program is against the public interest, in my view. It's not acceptable, and I think the public would feel that, in effect, that the sentence was far too lenient.
Cedar Cottage has a proven success rate in reducing recidivism. At what point do you make the tough decision and say, this may be an unpopular program, but it is the right thing to do for the safety of the community?
Look, as to the community, the program is supposed to act in the best interest of the child. They're supposed to be paramount. I'm not sure that the figures and assessments that have been done reflect that.
You don't agree with any of the academic assessments of the Cedar Cottage program and its recidivism rate?
I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that the main priority is to be the best interests of the child.
What if the best interests of the child are served by reducing the reoffending rate for child sexual abusers?
I say this, that these matters will be aired in the Court of Criminal Appeal, and that's the best time to hear about it.
This isn't the first time a Cedar Cottage sentence has been questioned and re-examined by politicians. 3 years ago, there was public outrage about another case. Taylor had been abused by her biological father.
From what I can remember, I was around 10 when it first started. When it got really bad, when he actually started full on doing it. At school, they were doing stuff on this kind of stuff. They were informing us about that you should never let anyone touch you or anything other than your parents. So at that stage, I was just like, well, what's going on here? School said it's okay. He's telling me not to tell anyone, though. What do I do? So I was really confused. I was at a loss, really. I remember straight after he did it, I ran to the toilet and I started crying my eyes out, thinking, wow, he's just raped me. Wow, I can't believe this has really just happened.
Taylor only saw her father on access visits, but the sexual abuse occurred virtually every visit for more than a year.
I always thought, oh, maybe it'll get better next time. Until it got to the point where I realised it's never going to get better. It's going to keep going like this until I do tell someone. And at that stage, my sister was meant to be going away with him for a week, just him and her. And I knew if I let that happen, then something would definitely occur there. And I couldn't let that happen to my sister.
Taylor's sister, who's 14, told Background Briefing she doesn't remember much of her childhood. Taylor's father was eventually charged on 74 counts, ranging from indecent assault to aggravated sexual assault. He was released on bail in order to attend the Cedar Cottage program. Taylor is now 15 and still furious her father didn't go to prison.
I wanted him to go to jail, where he belonged, so that he couldn't do that to anyone else. But apparently my opinion didn't matter to the court or to the program Cedar Cottage. They really didn't care how it affected me or my family. All they cared about was him, which is sick, really, because why does he matter? He brought this on himself. That was what he did. He had a choice. He knew better.
Taylor's father successfully completed the Cedar Cottage program and still attends on a voluntary basis. Taylor and her mother Larissa live in northern New South Wales, and they didn't attend any of the Sydney-based Cedar Cottage therapy. Larissa arranged local counselling, but she continued to receive face-up letters from her former partner at Cedar Cottage, confessing to the detail of what he'd done.
Here endeth part 2 of interfamilial sexual abuse.